Joe, what is your assessment, frankly, of your president, President Trump, so far?
Thank you, Shaka. Thank you for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure.
You're most welcome.
I think it's been a fairly successful year. Some minor setbacks, but I think overall for a political neophyte, he's done I think better than expected.
What are some of the major accomplishments in your view?
Wow, I mean, there's countless of them. Actually, this morning I called one of the president's advisors to ask him, hey, let's go over some of the list, and the list was quite long, actually. So you've got Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed. You have the removal of the U.S. from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You have the issues of immigration, illegal immigration is down. You've got tax cuts. You've got the stock market at an all-time high. Consumer confidence is an all-time high. So I think there's quite a few, positive things that one could credit the president for.
What about you, Robin?
Well, I think that if I look at the foreign policy side of the dynamic, particularly in the region where I've worked the most in Africa, I think there is a concern that the U.S. is sort of disengaging from the continent to some extent. I just spent a month out there, and that's what I heard the most. So this is what I'm sharing with you, what I heard, as opposed to my
Which
opinion on that.
Which parts of the continent
I was
did you
in
go
both
to?
West Africa and in Southern Africa. And so I think that there is a little bit of that kind of concern that we're not talking about Africa enough, we're not engaged enough, and there's uncertainty of what our policy toward Africa would be. So I'm still hopeful that we will have a stepped up engagement on the continent. I think there's a receptivity to that, and they're just waiting to see if that's going to happen.
What is the U.S. foreign policy towards Africa from your vantage point, really?
Well, what I've heard from those in the administration is that there's going to be a stronger emphasis and focus on business and on trade. And some of the other elements that we are used to engaging on will take a back seat to those two elements. My viewpoint, and I was actually pleased to see the National Security Strategy for 2018, which came out in December of 2017, because it really talks about the whole wide range of things that we've always done on the continent. And so I'm hoping that that's going to be the blueprint that we're going to continue to follow. But what I hear the most is the business and trade aspect of the discussion. And my point of view on that is that you still have to have good governance and an enabling environment for business and trade to flourish. One of my former bosses, Secretary of State Colin Powell, I don't know whether he coined this or what have you, but I first heard it from him. He said that business and money does not like instability and weak environments. So we've got, even if we push the idea of business and trade, which I agree with, we also still have to push the governance, democracy, and transparency aspects, because those go hand in hand with good business and good trade.
What do you mean by saying that business and money does not like instability? Let's face it, America has been doing business, for example, with the Democratic Republic of Congo, which at one time was Zaire under Mobutu Sese Seko for 32 years.
I think that, that's kind of the old Cold War model of business and trade, and I think we've changed, at least in the last decade, from that model for a long period of time. And we now expect to deal with partners who have good governance, that focus on transparency, that focus on fighting corruption. Those are the things that have become the pillars, the staples of U.S. policy in the region. And I expect those to continue. Because I think that with the new business framework and the new trade framework, you have to have those things.
You have to have those things. What about you, Joe? I mean, when someone talks about support effective governance, I mean, there are a lot of people who will tell you, if you look at the Great Lakes region of Africa, for example, you look at Central Africa and what have you, there is no such a thing there, really.
Well, let me first comment on Robin. I think she hit the nail on the head as to where the Trump administration is on Africa and its policy. I think it's forthcoming, and probably in the next 3 months there will be a politically appointed Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. So I think once that person's in place, they'll have more of a mandate with the Secretary of State and the President to really undertake the President's agenda.